Guess who wants back into politics? NBC out with a fantastic, in my view of it, story about who wants back into U.S. politics. Also, there's a country that wants something back from the United States. It was a gift a long time ago, and they're like, oh, no, we need it back. Find out what country wants to take what back from the U.S. All that and more coming up on this episode of Turning Point tonight. My name is Jobob, and together we are charting the course of America's cultural comeback. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Turning Point tonight. Now, you remember you can email the show at any point, tpt@tpusa.com. You can email whether you agree or you're wrong. We will read your email so long as it's disgusting and terrible and awful and bigoted. Likelihood of it getting read actually goes up if it falls into those categories. What I want to start with first, and we'll bring in our panel to discuss this in a second, is this whole Department of Education thing, and I think a big thing that's been missing from the entire conversation. It has been well documented that the Department of Education, when it was instituted all the way until now, has not, led to better outcomes for American students. Now, a lot of the focus has been on the younger students, which totally fine, K through 12, very, very important. What isn't necessarily being talked about a lot is the student loan aspect of the Department of Education. In case you didn't know this, the Department of Education facilitates, handles, and basically issues $1.6 trillion of U.S. student loan debt. That would make it the fifth biggest bank in the United States, which is a huge deal, and again, one that's not necessarily being talked about enough. In 1993, during the Clinton administration, the Department of Education also had a big push into backing student loans with federal money. They took it from private banks and made them federally backed. Okay, well, what did that do? Well, it made colleges go, hold on. The federal government is going to back these student loans. Let's jack up prices and charge these kids as much money as we possibly can, knowing that the feds are going to pay for it if the students can't. And just for the record, Republicans are not entirely absolved of any wrongdoing here. They helped remove the cap recently for the limits on how much money you could take out in grad school, regardless of whether or not your grad program actually benefited the community. Like if you were going to major or get a master's degree in, I don't know, African lesbian dance choreography, well, the federal government took away all of the limits as to how much you could take out to get that useless degree. Now, the student loan in the new process is set to move under the Treasury Department because, well, that would make sense. The people dealing with the money should deal with the money. But at the same time, the Wall Street Journal opinion section said was something that I agree, that the Department of Education as it stands should do an audit of where that federally backed student loan money is going and whether or not it's worth the taxpayers' liability. In other words, Linda McMahon, in the process of dismantling the Department of Education, should audit all of the student loans and make sure that U.S. taxpayers aren't on the hook for someone getting a master's degree in underwater basket weaving, hopefully too, to lessen the cost of higher education in this country. Here to comment on that and a whole bunch more is our awesome panel for the day. Media strategist Jillian Anderson King is here, as well as comedian Kay Vaughn, also here to talk the news of the day. Guys, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Jillian, I want to start with you. So we kind of covered the student loan process thing, but overall, the Department of Education, Trump signed the executive order yesterday. Libs, in lib fashion, lost their minds. I mean, is there a point where we finally get the libs to understand all of these variables in the Department of Education? None of them have turned out well for the American people, for students in the country, and even college students in the country at higher education. It hasn't worked across the board. How do we get that message across to the libs?
I think it's really easy to point out that our country thrived for more than 200 years without a Department of Education. It's really not that old Department of Education really isn't that old. And all we know is that they've wasted over $3 trillion of taxpayer money since its start under Jimmy Carter. They've spent their expenditure has been over 245% of their original cost, but they're not doing anything. We see kids across the nation failing at schools, well below reading and math proficiency. I tutor low income kids in our neighborhood. They are 3, 4 years behind their learning grades, but they are also pushed on them the DEI policies. I witnessed these things firsthand. These are horrible woke agendas that are put on these kids, and they can't even read or write, but they do know they have an F and they have a certain skin color, so that's okay. So I am a huge fan of ripping this apart. It's not beneficial to anybody, and I think the Democrats need to understand at any level, the states are going to know what their schools need, what their people need, what their children need better than anyone.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Kayvon, there's a, well, I like to look at things in terms of, well, can I do as bad of a job for less money? And when you look at the Department of Education, it's kind of easy. Is there something that you could do for the federal government and be as bad as the Department of Education and charge the taxpayer even less?
Well, I do know that the left is good at naming things, so they call it the Department of Education. So when Trump goes to cancel it, like, oh, he's against education, but they're not doing a deep dive like you are. So I'm glad you're bringing this up. It's also why they call it the Pride Festival. If you're against Pride, how dare you? But if they called it the Gay LGBT, sex toy festival, people might be against that festival. So it's time that we kind of like not buckle to the pressure just based on the name game. And whatever the left names, are doing the opposite, and they're doing it wrong.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's so often we see bills in Congress entitled "The No Bad Thing Should Happen to Any Good Person Ever," and then when somebody votes against it, like, why do you want bad things to happen to good people? And in reality, the bill sends $1 trillion to, I don't know, some dictator in Africa. It's just ridiculous. Speaking of ridiculous, France has, well, not France as the country, but a lawmaker in France has said they want the Statue of Liberty back. A guy named Raphael Glucksmann, who is a member of the European Parliament, made remarks saying that, well, you guys don't represent what that statue represents anymore, so we want it back. Jillian, if the United States, as it is right now, doesn't represent liberty, in other words, giving power back to the people and away from the federal government, what country out there does?
There's no country more free than America. And I think that people in France just don't understand that because they live in France. But also, we all watched the Paris Olympics recently, right? We know that they're a little out of their minds right now. Their sense of reality is not like you and I. When it comes to taking the Statue of Liberty, come and take it. We'd love to see you try.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask Kayvon. First of all, yeah, the Olympics is a great point. Like, yeah, good luck with that. But Kayvon, my response to that is come and take it. Now, since those comments were made and since the White House was asked about it, that particular French politician has said, well, I just meant, kind of as a metaphor of sorts. It wasn't actually speaking of that. But Kayvon, let's just put this in a hypothetical situation. Say the French do try to come over here and take the Statue of Liberty, and what happens, right?
Armed with their baguettes and their cheese. I mean, they have no ability to take us down. If you ever put America, just cut it out on a map and just lay it over Europe, it goes all the way to Asia and Russia and all the way down to Africa. So just rest easy tonight, Americans. I have a bigger controversy we should be going over. Is the Statue of Liberty a man or a woman? See, a lot of people just assume it's a woman, but that's what the men wore in those days with the gowns and holding things to read. Back then, women weren't allowed to read. So that could be a dude the whole time. And I have the same question about Macron's wife.
I think the whole Lady Liberty thing probably puts that to rest. But at the same time,
well, that's what we call it.
We call it that. Assuming that there's just two genders. Maybe
you're right. It could be a they them liberty. I'm so sorry. I apologize to those gays. I'm sorry, the French. Speaking of
tomato.
Speaking of things that are doing some ridiculous stuff, this is out from the Daily Wire. I thought this was fascinating. There's a top healthcare executive pushed for medical schools to accept students based on their race. Dr. Monique Butler was the president of the Graduate Medical Education for Hospital Cooperation in America, the HCA. She was quoted during a 2020 speech and among other times saying, "Diversity in healthcare cannot be a want. It is a must have. And therefore, obviously was then saying, well, we've got to admit people by race. Jillian, I know this sounds like a stop beating the dead horse type of situation. We've been over this and over this and over this. But how do we get the message across of, look, merit is a good thing. You don't want people in a position just because of what they look like. You want them to be able to do the job. And if you're looking for better outcomes for more races across the board, that still holds fast. It's still the priority to make sure merit is the qualifier and not race.
What does it take? I mean, it's going to take a few accidents. I mean, I wouldn't
Ugh.
trust a surgeon that is a DEI hire, just like I wouldn't fly with a DEI hire pilot, just like I don't vote for a presidential candidate that's a DEI candidate. I'm not going to go under the knife by a DEI doctor. No one should. No one of their loved ones deserve to have a less than an acceptable merit or acceptable a student, medical school student, that it doesn't make any sense to me. But what it's going to take is exactly what we saw recently with the unfortunate plane crashes. We cannot have DEI hires anywhere where lives are at stake. It have it in any workplace, any government employee. No one should have it. But especially in very critical positions, we need to have the highest standards, no matter who you're sleeping with, no matter the color of your skin. You have to be able to perform the job.
Yeah, Kayvon, you're in a pretty cutthroat industry in that comedy world. How much of that industry is based on, well, what people look like specifically, rather whether or not they're funny or not?
Well, that's the thing is, you see the left with the Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Ellen, Jimmy Oprah. They only want to platform people that are on their side of the fence. And so now the image is, well, there's no one funny on the right. That's just because they put up all these barricades and shadow ban you and block you. So we need to change that. But comedians don't really care about DEI. Like, you have to tell a joke, and if the crowd laughs at the same time, that joke was a winner. But what you're seeing from the radical left is clapter, where it's like, hey guys, I'm just here because I need to, screw Donald Trump. Like, that's their opening joke, and it gets a big round of applause. Like, to me, that's not clever. It's not funny. And I just hate seeing comedy like that. But if you have a DEI doctor, you might be DOA, dead on arrival.
Yeah, that's a big concern that I think a lot of Americans are finally waking up to. Jillian and Kayvon, they'll be back right after this to speak more about what's going on in the news today. We're also going to check in with White House correspondent Monica Page on this big new boom that makes bad guys go owie, which I'm sure she'll have a better term for. I think it's a fighter jet or something. Anyways, all that coming up on Really America's Voice on Turning Point tonight. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this.